When detectives began interrogating Henley about Carol, asking why he kept handcuffs to the plywood board and the plastic sheet in the bedroom, Henley no doubt panicked. Had he not said anything, it is possible that the police would never have learned about the murders. Instead, Henley let slip that Carol had once bragged about unaliving boys and burying them in a storage shed. When the police arrived at Southwest Boat Storage, a dry land marina, the detectives opened the windowless stall number 11 and they started digging. They found the first body in a matter of minutes, trying to get the carrion-like odor out of his nose. 30-year-old detective Larry Earls chain smoked cigarettes, but his hands were so filthy that someone else had to put them in his mouth. The police allowed the reporters to walk right up to Henley, who was standing outside the storage unit, and interview him. A television reporter even filmed Henley using a radio phone to call his mother. He cried into the receiver, "Mama, Mama, I've unalived Dean." Most of the reporters felt sorry for him. Ann James, the Post's police reporter, later wrote that she thought of him as a kind of folk hero who had slain the dragon. The night when the police sent out for fried chicken, she made sure Henley got his share. By the next day, however, Henley was admitting his involvement to the Pasadena police. Soon after, Brooks was escorted to the Houston Police Department by his distraught father, who told detectives that his son also had something to say. Henley showed the police the burial site at Sam Rayburn Reservoir. Then he and Brooks took them to High Island. Besides an army of reporters watching the diggings at the beach, there were bikini-clad girls and their boyfriends, along with young parents and children with plastic pails and shovels. At one point, a black chihuahua jumped into one of the graves and started barking. Over at NASA, Mercury astronaut Deke Slayton ordered a helicopter containing infrared equipment to fly over the beach to see if it could spot any other bodies. Some of the more recent victims were quickly identified. One of those found under the storage shed, Marty Jones, who had been murdered in late July, turned out to be the cousin of homicide detective Carl Schizenberger, who happened to be on the scene. Devastated, Schizenberger ended up unalived himself in 1977. Other bodies were able to be identified because of Social Security cards or driver's license was found near their decomposed remains. Jimmy Glass's family was able to identify him only because his beloved leather jacket was next to his skeleton. Soon reporters were fanning out through the heights, knocking on doors. Josephine Agar, a hairdresser who had spent the past year and a half burning a candle in hopes that her son Frank would come home, had already lost a son, Ronnie, in 1969. She had accidentally run over him in front of Helms Elementary. Not sure what to say to the reporters about her latest loss, she broke down in muted sobs. Louis Garcia, the father of Homer, who had attended a driver's education class with Henley, was just returning from South Texas when he had buried his mother, who had suffered a debilitating stroke after hearing the news that her grandson was missing. Not long after Louis pulled into his driveway, a police officer arrived to tell him and his wife, Doris, that Homer's body had been identified as one of Carol's victims. Doris could not sleep for days. She kept dreaming that her son had been buried alive and was trying to claw his way out. Throughout the summer and into the fall, families huddled around open graves at Houston Cemetery, burying their boys. Trying to beat back her despair, Betty Cobble, the mother of one of the victims, returned to her job delivering flowers, only to find herself providing arrangements at funerals for other victims. 6 months after Danny Yates's funeral, his parents moved to another part of Houston, hoping that a fresh start would erase their suffering. It didn't. Long after they settled into their new home, they divorced. The Waltrip brothers' father, Everett, the construction worker, moved to Atlanta, which didn't help. There, he read Brooks's confession, which had been reprinted in a newspaper. Everett learned He had been working on a new apartment complex directly across the street from Carol's place, one apartment. Maybe he had them in the apartment when I went to work. Waltrip said to the Chronicle. Maybe they were being tortured right next door and I didn't know it. Some parents turned to pills or alcohol to cope with the pain. I'm a glass. Jimmy's mother spiraled out of control. Many times she'd see a teenager hitchhiking on another side of the freeway and she'd shout, "That's Jimmy. We've got to turn around." And to keep the peace, my dad would turn around every time, says Willie Glass. Then one day she got a gun and grabbed my younger sister, Pamela, and dragged her to the back bedroom. When the SWAT team arrived, she fired a shot into the floor and yelled, "They're not going to steal Pamela from me like they did my Jimmy." We got the pew away from her and took her to the Harris County Psychiatric Unit. She was never the same. Neither were the rest of us. Dean Corll didn't just unalive 27 boys, he unalived 27 families. But was it only 27 boys? One of the bodies at High Island was identified as Jeffrey Conan, salutatorian, at St. Thomas High School, a private Catholic school west of downtown Houston, before he enrolled at the University of Texas on September 1st, 1970, about 3 months before Brooks first saw Jimmy and Danny tied up in Carol's bed. The 18-year-old Conan had hitchhiked from Austin to Houston to see his girlfriend. He got a ride to the Galleria area, and the last time he was seen, he was hitchhiking again, looking for another ride to his girlfriend. If Carol had been able to pull off that killing by himself, as well as unalives of Jimmy Glass and Danny Yates, didn't it seem likely that he had hunted others on his own? From 1968 to 1970, a few thousand missing persons reports came into the juvenile division of the Houston Police Department. Surely some of those kids were missing because they had run into Carol. The authorities did dig up the backyard of the Pasadena home where Carol was living, and they searched behind the old candy factory, but only a few weeks after the first bodies were found, the authorities called off excavation. The Chambers County Sheriff, who oversaw the High Island diggings, said inexplicably that he had decided to stop the searches until he received definite information on the location of other graves, apparently never considering that there could have been more bodies that Brooks and Henley did not know about. "It always bothered me," says Larry Earls, the young homicide detective. "Henley and Brooks told us that they thought there were more bodies and there were other places where we wanted to dig, but we were told no." Bob Wright, the executive director of the marketing communications at Stephen F. Austin University, who was a Houston radio reporter in 1973, says that he was told by a detective that once the body count surpassed the U.S. mass murder record, the excavations were halted. Did civic leaders want the search stopped because they were concerned about how high the count would go? Beating the record by just one or two bodies, after all, was a lot less humiliating than beating it by 10 or 15. But in the end, the number didn't matter. America's city of the future got hit with a torrent of negative publicity. The Vatican's daily newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, published an editorial that said that the Houston killings belonged to the domain of the devil, and even Izvestia, the government newspaper of the Soviet Union, got in a shot at the Houston, claiming that indifference and murderous bureaucracy were the reasons the killings had gone on for so long. Furious, the city's domineering police chief, Herman Short, held a press conference in which he suggested that the boys were mere runaways whose parents didn't do their best to look after them. He angrily declared that the reports' links among the victims and the killings were a myth created by the media. While he was at it, he took his own shot at the Izvestia. "I wonder if they'd like to write a little story about the number of people the government has unalived over there, taking their property and annihilating them," he said. Mayor Louis Welch defended the chief, bluntly declaring that the police can't be expected to know where a child is if his parents don't. Welch simply didn't know what he was talking about, though it was true that some of the boys had run away from home for brief periods and others had gotten into minor trouble. Mark Scott had once been arrested for carrying a knife, for example. None of them had gotten into serious trouble. Many were just like David Hilligist, straight-arrowed, all-American kids who rarely missed a day of school. Nevertheless, the teenage runaway story got traction. Governor Dolph Briscoe appealed to runaway teenagers in Texas to contact their parents and let them know they were alive and well. A young senator from Minnesota, Walter Mondale, asked Congress to allocate $30 million over 3 years to set up a nationwide system of halfway houses for runaway teenagers so that they would have a safe place to go and not end up at the hands of a killer like Carol. Meanwhile, when a California legislature learned that the education textbook used in the state schools, Human written by University of Houston psychology professor James Leslie McCrae, had been found among Carroll's belongings, he wrote Governor Ronald Reagan a letter demanding that the book be withdrawn from California schools, in part because it suggested that homosexuality was not an abnormal behavior. Perhaps you should take a trip to Texas, the legislature wrote Reagan, and asked the parents of the 27 young boys if the unusual expressions Carroll engaged in should be considered abnormal. The one thing that Chief Short did do, in a misguided attempt to make sure such crimes didn't happen again, was order his officers to raid the city's gay bars. They thought they were all child molests anyways, and unalivers, says Ray Hill, one of the city's first gay activists. Some residents claiming they were afraid that other deviants might be operating in the neighborhood circulated a petition asking the city council to impose a nightly curfew on juveniles, forgetting that almost all the Carroll's abductions took place in broad daylight. In those years, of course, plenty of people tended to believe falsely that homosexuality was linked to pedophilia, but neither could begin to explain what Carroll had done. How had a smiling mama's boy transformed himself into a colossal monster? Did he feel such a sense of shame over his own desires that he ended up despising the very objects of his affection? Is that also why he tortured the boys, because he needed to unleash his fury at them for feeling that desire in the first place? I think old Dean tried for years to be a normal person, to have a relationship with a woman, to do everything his mother wanted him to do, says David Mulliken, a plainclothesman, 71-year-old retired Pasadena homicide detective who investigated the killings. And all I can tell you is something came unleashed inside him, madness maybe, or evil. Sitting one afternoon at the Pepper restaurant in Pasadena eating a chicken fried steak, his belly straining at his shirt buttons, Mulliken pulled out some photos of himself from 1973 standing beside other cops who worked the case. In the photos, he's thin and 33, wearing bell-bottoms, a white belt, and a striped shirt with a tie that doesn't quite reach his navel. I can go back to that first day at the storage unit when we started digging, he said, and just like that, the smell comes back to me, the smell of all those rotting. Unable to finish his sentence, he puts down his fork and doesn't eat another bite. He sifts through his photos again. How that man was able to go out to that storage shed time and time again and bury one more dead boy is something I'll never understand, Mulligan says after a few seconds. You get close to evil like that, no matter how long ago it was, and it never leaves you.